All right, so we are live. So if those of you, I don't know if you all are able to find the link on social media. I'm sorry that this is so technologically unsound. I should have help next week, onboarding somebody to help me with some of these technology glitches who's going to start next week. So for right now, you're just going to get Chioma version of what that looks like, which is real messy. I mean, different Zoom links and now streaming live, not exactly my skill set as, what do they call us, geriatric in our millennialness. So welcome. We're very excited. This is our first week of a 7-week series, which is the Caregivers Special Education Boot Camp. And we just had our session. So every week we have a private session with 10 participants who were selected out of a pool of applicants to participate in the political education boot camp to learn how to navigate and hopefully escape different booby traps set that may land them and their families, their children, their young ones, people that they love that are in their care and are self-advocates, navigating these systems as someone who is also needing support and not punishment in order to get what we all need for a quality of life and to just live trauma-free. So tonight we're going to be talking about our understanding of carceral systems. And that means many things. And so we in our private session, we went through just ideas that would lead to strengthening and supporting carceral, as well as some ideas, at least one, the refrigerator mother theory, that has become a real reason, particularly for the child welfare system, to use actively against parents by, putting various developmental concerns that lead to behavioral health issues in young people and putting that blame on the mother as a reason to separate the child. But we're going to get in detail here with Samantha Davis, who I'm just really excited to hear. It keeps saying prepare to go live. Why is it not yet going live? I don't know. So I'm going to stop that live stream. It's the recording, and I'm just going to go live on regular Facebook. No fancy workspace stuff here. I'm just going to do the old school Facebook situation. Then just want to intro Sam in a minute. It says another live is being enabled, and this live is now live. Okay, so we are live. We're now actively live. We were play live before, now we are. In a minute. Okay, so I think we are live. Oh. We're now actively live. We were play live before, now we are. Okay, so that's, sorry, me hearing myself. So I'm going to pass it on to Sam, who is the founder and executive director of Black Swan Academy, which is a youth-focused organization, and is also leading the DC Police Free Schools Coalition, which happily you're proud of as far as Chiborn Cree as a partner in the Child Justice Coalition. So I'll pass it on to you, Sam. You actually have a full bio. I want to read your bio. Let me back up for a second. I frazzled on my technology glitch here that I thought it was really important, especially the project that you're doing with your family. So give me a minute. I will just read your bio. So it's says, so Sam's bio, as stated, is, again, she's a founder and executive director of Black Swan Academy. She's an advocate, a trainer, an organizer, and an unyielding optimist. She believes that everyone has the ability to succeed and must be given the opportunity to do so. She started Black Swan just at the age of 25, and I think one of our caregivers is that exact age, so hopefully is being motivated by by Sam. In 2019, Samantha started the Sam and Tamara Davis Family Scholarship Fund with her siblings to support graduating high school seniors in her hometown of Pittsburgh who have a parent with a mental or physical disability and or were raised in a single adult household. She currently serves on the Black Women and Girls Advocacy Task Force in the Self-Development of People National Committee of Presbyterian Church USA. She's the former field engagement manager of the YWCA USA, where she developed a new state level advocacy initiative and nationwide get out the vote effort and mobilization and mobilize over 200 associations to do racial and gender justice work. Samantha has a master's in public policy from American University. She's been recognized by American University, Pittsburgh Public School, Boys and Girls Club of Greater Washington, the National Urban League, and among Essence 2019 Woke 100. So welcome, Sam. We're very honored to have you join us to kick off our series here.
Thank you so much. It is really cool to be in the room with folk who identify as caregivers, as I identify as a caregiver as well. Really appreciate all the work that you do, Chioma, and all the work that I imagine you all are holding and representing for your families and your communities. Really looking forward to this conversation today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have some slides prepared for you all. I can assure you that we're not going to get through all of them. And also, I find slides to be more accessible for various learning styles. So you'll see me kind of skipping through some. I will share these slides with Chioma after this conversation, so you all are more than happy to kind of go through at your own pace. But today we're going to be talking about the orientation and understanding of carceral systems in our schools. As was mentioned, I am the founder and executive director of Black Swan Academy. We support Black youth in DC, throughout DC, middle school and high school age. And while they do campaigns, short-term campaigns on a number of issues, from housing to mental health to gun violence, they are also working with young folks throughout the city, adults, parents, educators, on a campaign to remove police from schools and more broadly dismantle the entire policing infrastructure, which is not just the physical police, right, but all of the various ways that young people experience policing. And so want to ground us in a few terms before we get started to kind of better understand the framework that I'm operating from when I talk about policing and its context in the states and its connection to our education system. So we're just going to talk a little bit about terms, talk about the history of school policing. Potentially we'll get into the Police Free Schools DC campaign, and then be able to answer questions and hopefully have a conversation. For the purpose of this space today, there are just a few kind of community agreements I want to offer. No shade, no judgment, right? Everyone will feel more free to contribute if we treat each other with respect. One mic, please respect the person who is speaking. Mute your mic when you are not talking. And then listen, engage, and participate. I am not one to just talk at folk. And so I'm going to be asking you all questions, asking your thoughts, and bringing you in to the presentation in hopes that if you're able, you can kind of support with the presentation by reading or by, again, kind of sharing your thoughts and your experiences. So terms to know, when we're talking about the carceral system, we're talking about policing, surveillance, punishment, the ways in which the state uses violence and harm as a way to separate, as a way to imprison its people, right? And it's important when we're thinking about the carceral system to really think about the root and the foundation of America and all of the things that the carceral system is either perpetuating or is a tool of. The three kind of systems or kind of larger ideologies that I point to are racism, capitalism, and patriarchy. Want to see if anyone in this space feels comfortable reading the first definition of racism? And if so, you can just unmute yourself.
I'll kick it off and hopefully others will join with us. Oh, go for it, Elizabeth.
Okay. Racism is the complex ways in which history, policies, practices, and cultural representations interact to maintain power through a racial hierarchy and creating, I can't tell what that word is, it blurred, racialized outcomes, it looks like.
Yeah, thank you. When we think about racism and we think about the carceral system as I just described it, can anyone lift up one example of how the carceral system, again, all ways of policing, imprisonment, punishment, how does the carceral system perpetuate racism?
I guess if you think about specifically in DC, no matter where you go, whether it's a doctor's office, the grocery store, there's always security guards. So it makes us feel like we always need policing. But when you go to some of the nicer areas, they may not have that, like I'll say people of color don't frequent, you don't see security.
Yeah, absolutely. So just the ways in which physical police and security personnel are placed in predominantly Black neighborhoods, Black communities, or other people of color communities, like the physical presence of over-policing in our communities. Great example. We're gonna move to capitalism. Is there a volunteer to read capitalism?
Do it. Capitalism is an economic system in which countries' trade, industry, and profit are controlled by private companies instead of by the people who time and labor powers those companies.
Thanks, Chioma. For anyone, can anyone think of an example of how the carceral system perpetuates, I could also say is a product of or is a tool for capitalism? I can offer that for me, the biggest example is private prisons and even public prisons, but just how much money states are pouring into prisons, just how much money various corporations are making by being in relationship with prisons. Feel like I grew up being told that people are getting paid for however many beds that they fill. And to a certain extent, that is very true. The other part that you see often of is when we talk about free prison labor, where a number of community members who are incarcerated are working literally for free, putting money in other people's pockets without the mind of their own well-being economically or socially. Does that make sense for folk or resonate with folk?
Yeah, I was gonna say basically criminalizing being poor. Essentially, you're too poor to afford the additional taxes that come with, say, owning a car. So you have to have insurance in order to own a car. You have to pay registration. You have to pay for a driver's license. Like those basic necessities that if you're a poor person and you don't necessarily have access to the capital to maintain that, then you face incarceration because you can't afford to keep up with it.
Yep. Yep. Thank you. And then lastly, patriarchy. I can go ahead and read this one. Patriarchy is a political social system in which history, policies, practices, and cultural representations interact to maintain power of cis heterosexual men, often white, and oppress others by inserting dominance through various forms of psychological terrorism and violence. Anyone have an example of, again, carceral systems perpetuating, contributing to patriarchy?
Can I just add, and I really want to encourage, I know we're all new to this process. Please, this is live, but it's also a safe place to unpack your thinking, and no wrong, no right. But I would just say, when I think of like a classically patriarchal process that is very oppressive, is the child welfare system, right? It's very intentional, typically to vulnerable mothers, particularly single mothers, and those that your foundation works towards, those with mental disabilities, those who may be judged. And I think that's a patriarchal process that informs.
Absolutely, thank you. I was actually going to throw a hint, like we just talked about it in the introduction. I think the child welfare system and in general, how we criminalize poverty, yes, and how we criminalize motherhood, how we criminalize parenthood, when we're talking about just about every system, and that both the expectations and the judgment that often falls on mothers. So we went through those terms again because it's important when we're talking about carceral systems to intentionally think, how is this practice, how is this action actually contributing to racism, patriarchy, capitalism, all kind of political and social ideologies that have contributed to the oppression of marginalized folk in this country, and really globally, but we won't get into that, but in this country. A few other definitions that I'll read quickly. The prison industrial complex. Prison industrial complex is a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that uses surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. So for example, I think the piece of this definition that I really want you all to focus on is the latter piece. So we're talking about using surveillance and policing and imprisonment as solutions of economic, social, and political problems. How we criminalize poverty instead of actually solving poverty. How we criminalize houselessness instead of actually solving houselessness, so on and so forth. Policing is a social relationship made up of a set of practices that are empowered by the state to enforce law and social control through the use of force. Criminalization is a process through which actions become illegal and people become labeled criminal. Entire groups of people and communities are criminalized when targeted by policing. And then I offer abolition in hopes that we talk a little bit about the campaigns that are happening as a framework. So one of the campaigns that Black Swan is leading is the Police Free Schools campaign. And the Police Free Schools campaign does operate through an abolitionist framework. What do we mean by abolition? Abolition is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. An abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. So Getting us to schools, there is, and I'll send a link out following this so you all can interact with it. We don't have time for the day, but the Investment Project has created a really awesome tool of a timeline, like a literal timeline of the history of school policing. While we won't go through the timeline today, I do want to highlight some what I think are crucial points throughout our history when we're thinking about the orientation of the carceral systems within schools. One thing that I find is important is that when we think about the way we criminalize Black young people and education systems, it's important to note that the criminalization of Black people seeking education, trying to learn, roots back in slavery, right? In the 1831s, we've all heard that like Black folk, enslaved folk were not supposed to read or write. What I did not know was that we actually put pen to paper to make it illegal for Black people to learn in response of Black people rebellion, having rebellions. So states in response to slave rebellions as of the 1831s literally put pen to paper, wrote laws to make it illegal for Black people to learn, right? So the restriction of learning, the limitation of education for Black people was one rooted in oppression. If you're going to speak out against us, if you're going to fight us, if you're going to rebel, then we are now criminalizing this very normal behavior of you learning. Other pieces that's important to know is the calls for education equity were met with domestic terrorism and institutional violence in the form of suspensions, expulsions, threats of budget cuts, and school closures, surveillance, and police presence. All of us have probably seen those historic pictures of predominantly white women yelling and screaming at little Black girls walking into schools being escorted by police. What we often don't get to, though, is that the exclusionary practices of suspensions, expulsions, school closures, surveillance, police presence did not exist in the ways that it did today until integration. And so integration, while folk can argue whether it was a good thing or not, but integration is responsible for all these other tactics of exclusions we saw of Black young people trying to learn. So it's not surprising, right, that today, when we think about the racial disparities of suspensions or expulsions of arrest, it's not surprising that that gap is so wide, that Black girls in DC are 20 times more likely to be suspended than white boys or girls. And so again, when we're thinking about carceral systems in connection to education, wanting to just ground us in all of these tools are used not for safety, which we often like to think of it is, or are often taught it is, but are used for the oppression of Black young people, of other marginalized populations. In 1972, these are kind of all over the place. In 1972, urban school districts in 40 states had some form of a school policing infrastructure. Police presence in schools correlated with new laws, practices, targeting and criminalizing adolescent behavior and cultural expression of Black, brown, feminine, and queer students. We talked about back in the 1830s, how people put pen to paper to criminalize regular behavior. That's what we're seeing happening starting in the 1950s all the way throughout what was happening in schools, where it is now considered criminal. In some cases, I think it was in Baltimore actually, and I'll follow up, so fact check this, that it was a law that young people could not disrupt class. And so if young people were disruptive in class, in whatever form of disruption, that they could be arrested for it. And so again, looking at the ways that law, carceral systems and schools are connected and how we're criminalizing young folk in those spaces. There's a number of examples of it. Another example I will offer is in Philadelphia in the 60s, young people were organizing very much like they're organizing today, making calls for more history, making calls for Black educators, for various social emotional supports. And instead of receiving those resources, young folk were suspended, young folk were expelled, and young folk were met with hundreds of armed police officers at their schools when the young folk peacefully protested. 1994, our now President Joe Biden, when he was running, this was a huge deal. Folk talked about how he pushed forward the crime bill. The reason why the crime bill is so important is because the crime bill is responsible for the heightened levels of policing within our schools. In the past 20 years, $1.1 billion has been directed through grants, through federal grants particularly, into school policing alone. And then we saw that continue to heighten when Columbine mass shooting happened. And then similarly, after Sandy Hook, after Parkland, what we saw were elected officials using those as justification to invest deeper into school policing models that are disproportionately applied in schools that have majority young people of color. And to date, we have the largest school police presence there ever has been before. I'm offering this definition for when we talk about police-free schools. I mentioned it earlier, but police-free schools is a global campaign. DC's police-free schools campaign started around 2018, 2019. And the definition that we're all using is dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. I'm gonna pause for a moment and just see if there are any questions. And because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the chat. So if there's conversations or questions that should be lifted up, if you all can lift that up.
In the chat, it's just Elizabeth shared a document. I haven't clicked on it yet to see. But I do have a question in terms of, so the school to prison pipeline, do you know who is mostly impacted? And is there, are there students that are receiving more so-called disciplinary engagement than others? And what's your thought on that?
Yeah, great question. There's a slide somewhere here, maybe, or actually, I'm gonna stop this and I'm gonna share a video. So yes, school to prison pipeline. So we're talking about suspensions, we're talking about expulsions, we're talking about restraints, we're talking about actual arrest and imprisonment. Most impacted in DC and really nationally are Black young people and Black young people with disabilities. So in DC, 2019 was the last full year of school. That's crazy. Last full year of school when young people were in school in person. That year, 100% of school-based arrests were of young people of color, 100%. 92% were of Black young people, and then 33% were of young people of color with a disability, with a known, let me say that too, with a known disability. And so what we know is when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, that those who are impacted most are those who are at the margins of the margins. We also know that many of those arrests or references to referrals to police stem from either normal adolescent behavior, that when it's a young person with disabilities, when it's a Black young person, it's then criminalized. Trauma responses. So you also see a extremely large disparity in girls, particularly who are interacting with police officers, and it's because they're being referred to police officers for trauma responses. So if they've experienced sexual violence, if they're experiencing any type of issues within the household, and express that often externally because they're adolescents, that instead of getting the support and resources they need, they're referred to the police. And so that's the outcome and kind of who is impacted most when we're talking about these. Other questions, thoughts, Renee?
Hi, everybody. Well, I wanted to lift up that question, that discussion piece about the criminalization of Black women and girls. I guess that there's a couple articles I've seen about how the adultification of Black girls, that the responses that people have had to what we would think of as normalized behaviors within the continuum of their disability, such as this is personal experience with my daughter, who's an autistic 17-year-old, and the problem that happened that seems to really get to me is that it just accelerates. The older she's had the same face and kid and characteristics of autism since she was diagnosed, pretty much. But what's changed is societal's response to her autism, not necessarily her, And so, so whether you're in the healthcare sector, whether you're out in the community,
Absolutely.
walking around the neighborhood, at school, this week they were really trying it this week. This was a really big week for me because, as I'm working on her individual education plan, her IEP planning, and I'm looking at her paperwork and I'm just thinking, God, I never did find a school that didn't have positive behavior supports or PBIS systems, which I think definitely, for God forbid, do a certain thing with behaviors that are that relate to autism. Elopement, like a lot of my service providers, in terms of the healthcare systems that I have set up for her in the home, a lot of my service provider contracts now state explicitly in the contract that, well, if your kid elopes, our company's policy is to call the police. And I'm like, I was like, wait a minute, why do you guys call the police now? They're like, well, our lawyers have told us that we have to, if your child elopes while they're under our medical care, we can't do anything but call police. And I'm like, well, that doesn't sound right to me, but so again, I'm really, I think the intensity of the policing of Black and female bodies increases with age, and it and accelerates, up until blank, whatever, So in my own research that I've been doing with Chioma on her other projects with some of the other projects Chioma's worked on, I was looking at the criminal justice data. So I was wondering, how fresh is that statistic? Because to my knowledge, DC does not keep track of the gender of the young people that are criminally involved, carcerally involved, or referred to by special officers. Do you think there's any way to kind of get to those real numbers aside from legislation? Anyway, so yeah, please forgive me, guys. I know that's a lot. I know I just threw a whole load. I just kind of just went right to the chase on this one.
That was I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thank you. And it's real, right? And the video I was going to play talks about our young people, Sion and London in particular, they often talk about, I always forget how they say it. They say police contribute to the adultification and the eraser of Black childhood. And when we're talking about Black girls and female bodies, Georgetown released a study a few years back now that showed that by the age of 5, Black girls are perceived much older than they actually are. And so what happens with that adultification is you're now looking at this Black 5-year-old girl, looking at her behaviors, looking at her expressions, and saying she should know better because she's an adult. Just over last year, 9-year-old, I think in Rochester, New York, there was a video that went viral. Police were called to the house because she was in crises. She was in a mental health crisis. Police were called to the house. The police tried to arrest her and put her in the car, in the cop car. She's crying, you can see it and hear it. She's crying for her father, I believe. And the police say, "You're acting like a child." 9-year-old, the police officer said, "You're acting like a child." And the 9-year-old said, "I am a child." They threatened her with pepper spray. She continued to be the 9-year-old child that they were, and she was pepper sprayed. And so thank you, Renee, for lifting up that example and naming adultification, because that's exactly what it is. And when we're talking about Black bodies, that's how it's shown up with policing. The numbers, I just pulled this up. So in DC, this was 2018 data. Black girls in DC are 30 times more likely to be arrested. And 60% of girls arrested in DC are under the age of 15. Under the age of 15. So that adultification piece is a huge factor to that. The thinking about the foundations that we were just talking about, racism, patriarchy, right? All of that is coming to play when we talk about those items.
Well, thank you. I wanted to say thank you. Sorry, I'm taking a mom moment for some peace and quiet. I'm sitting in my car listening to this, so please. And I see that there are some people in the chat, so I'm going to mute my voice and stop my video. But I am listening. I'm just in a car, getting some peace and quiet. So thank you for that line.
Absolutely, thank you. Enjoy your peace and quiet. I want to pause just to see if there's any other questions, but did want to show a couple videos to bring young folk into this space with us. But if there's any questions right now, happy to answer them, or offerings.
Hello, I have a question. My name is Francis, and I was listening to a whole lot of what you brought out. And I guess my question or my concern is, I have a daughter. She's 16 right now. She'll be 17 in June. And we've been going through a whole lot of the same scenarios and events when dealing with the police. We can't never get help with CHAMPS or any other service providers we have been using. We're currently in a certain situation right now where my daughter eloped from the home again. And we just met with CFSA. We had a family meeting today. So my question is, when there's a crisis situation occurring, what number can we call? Like, I don't like calling the police because the few times they did come, it was very scary. You know, they caused everything in my home to be trashed. I have other children, and they were trying to get my daughter to comply. No techniques of calming her down. They actually hurt her ankle when trying to get her out the home. And it scared my little one really badly. He's 8 now, but at the time he was 7. And I'm trying to find out what is another way I can get help when she goes into a crisis without calling the police.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you than the answer I'm about to give. So last year, there was an effort to, when folk call 311 or 911, that dispatchers should be getting trained. And if you identify it as a mental health crisis, that clinicians or folk from, I believe DBH, the DC Behavioral Health or otherwise, but crisis response team, basically, non-police crisis response team should be sent instead of police. It is a pilot program, which means it doesn't have as many resources. And in this year, I have heard from at least 3 people, and hearing maybe that you've been trying to use Champs, that it hasn't been people's experiences, that police officers are still showing up instead. Chioma, Champs has been around. I thought, is Champs new?
No, Champs isn't new. Champs does work with DBH, but I think is privately run by Catholic Charities. I mean, they do come into schools, but sometimes we've seen that schools are weaponizing calling of Champs instead of actually, because kids are then, Champs has even said, hey, we're not here to remove the kids from school. It's to de-escalate a crisis when possible. And if it's not possible, then remove. So schools historically have been upset if the child has been removed, but the child has not been removed because Champs is like, we're here to de-escalate and this does not cause. So they end up, in a very unfortunate situation because they're supposed to help and they can't, and they're not really equipped, particularly if there's a co-occurring situation like autism, right? Like that takes a special skill set if a child is in crisis versus if the child verbal or nonverbal. I mean, there's a lot of considerations that that Champs may not be ready to support on certain levels.
So I'm wondering, because I'm aware of Champs, and I know we don't got a lot of time, but so not to derail us. I just quickly Googled it. So what I'm referring to is new as of June. So in June, there was funding in a I'm saying huge initiative, but separate from my understanding of Champs, to divert calls from police to behavioral health clinicians. I see people with their hands raised, and I'm wondering if that is resonating with folk. Either way, it's not up to par, but go ahead, Liz or Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of to piggyback on what Chioma is saying, I have literally seen in schools that because of the way the new policy is done, police officer cannot remove a child from school. So what they do is they call the police first, then they call Champs. Champs can remove the child from the school, then the police takes the child from Champs and does whatever. I don't know what happens after that. I have seen it with my own eyes with a 2nd grader. And I'm like, okay, at what point do you call the parents? They call the parents after the child has already been taken wherever the child is going to go. That's the first thing. The second thing, I haven't seen the initiative that you're talking about put in place, but I have seen like advertisements for it. There's supposed to be a number that you can call, and 911 is supposed to divert them. But also the part that they don't tell you about that is sometimes a police officer will show up, but the police officer has been trained to provide services for a person that has experience with behavioral health concerns. But my problem with that is my child was restrained in a school, and the person that restrained him was a person that was trained in how to properly assist a child that's, having issues in school. However, at that time, that particular person that restrained him did not have authorization to do so, and my child should have never been anywhere near that person. So it's like there's Band-Aids being put everywhere, but none of it is really addressing the issue. At no time, it's like, okay, I'm gonna tell you once, I'm gonna tell you twice, and then you're penalized. There's no, okay, let's give this person space. Let's make sure that, you know, the access spaces so they can't actually leave the building. There's no calm down. There's no attempt to de-escalate the situation. It's either you comply or you're ejected.
Yeah. Yeah, and which is why, Francis, I started by saying I don't have a good answer for you. I don't have an answer that I like for you. I have experienced as this is like the reality of the time that we live in, and that no one has moved forward. And by no one, I'm talking about folk in elected positions have moved forward with radical investments. One, for us to get the resources that we actually deserve. And two, for the practices that are harmful, right, to be prohibited and banned altogether in the first place. And I believe, I know like people, I talk about being an optimist, but I do believe that a large part of it is because folk are operating from a theory of change that says Black folk are criminal, that says Black children are criminal and are to be feared, regardless of the crises, regardless of the reality that's going on there. I'd rather invest in these harmful, punitive carceral practices than invest radically in the resources that they actually deserve and that would address the root cause of what's going on. I am actually, this is being streamed, so I won't share all of the information, but I'll follow up with you, Chioma, in email. I have a meeting with some people who are doing further exploration on MPD and mental health interventions. Would love to invite some of you all in that meeting with me. And so I'll send a follow-up email with details on that. But this is, y'all are not alone. Particularly, and I'm not sure, particularly in the past 3 or 4 months, I'm not sure why, but in the past 3 or 4 months, we've been hearing more and more and more from people experiencing things to this level. So hoping you all can come to this meeting with us, and we can work together on addressing some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely sounds good. I mean, that's part of why we've created this cohort, is to create these kinds of opportunities. Thank you for that invitation. I do want to ask permission though, considering we had some technical issues getting on, would you mind particularly, Sam, and then for others to stay on just 10 minutes, just so that, you know, we can close things out correctly and even take some questions. I know, Francis, you had your hand up. I don't know if you want to add something else. Is that cool, Sam?
Yeah, that's fine with me. Happy to.
Hopefully that's good with everyone else. You guys can chime in the chat if it isn't, or just feel free to exit. And of course, we'll see you next week. But Francis, do you want to state your question? I know you had a hand up for a while and then put it down.
Yes, I just wanted to, I guess, agree to what they were saying. I did have someone tell me that before, that they should have a derision when I call the police if I state it's a crisis. That the police that's trained to de-escalate the issue will come out, or someone else will come out, because I have unsuccessfully received help from CHAMPS. They constantly say that they're going to come out and de-escalate, but they never do. I don't know if it's because of demographics, the area, or it's a number of things that go through my mind with that. But yes, I do agree, and I would love to join the meeting if that's okay.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I am not telling you that, I'm not suggesting that you should call 911 and trust that they're going to divert it, because 2 of the examples, maybe 3 of the examples, folk did not get the support that they thought they were going to get, and armed police, whether trained or not, showed up at their door when they were expecting a behavioral health expert. So I'm just telling you what is supposed to happen, and also it's not always happening. So
I think it may be the new 988 number. I think it came up at the Coordinating Council for School-Based Mental Health, which are public meetings. And that's unfortunate that that's what's happening, because people are supposed to call that number for mental health interventions, not for police interventions. But maybe it's a staffing issue. I don't know what the issue is. Maybe we can find out together.
yeah, absolutely. So can stay on 10 minutes trying to figure out what's the best use of time. Chioma, you're most familiar with the work that we do. What feels helpful to share?
Yeah, I mean, I would, because of, the coupling with the Coma Project, as part of Police Free Schools, I would love if you could, and others, please, if there are things that you want to hear Sam talk about, please put it in the chat, or feel free to come off of mic to talk about. But I'm mostly curious at this point, right? So you talk about Columbine, but we do have this local law that Renee particularly frames it, our local Columbine, the tragic events that happened on South Capitol Street, I think in 2010, and that is the law that bases the school-based mental health. Next week's talk is going to be on particularly that. Now, I'm mostly concerned that we don't even have a clear understanding of the carcerality in the care side, right? Yeah. So we know the cops, the boogeyman, police are terrible, but more passive aggressively, patriarchally, there's almost a direct attack on the households when it comes to some of the other systems that families touch at school, like truancy, that's direct referral and entry into the court, and then just other ways of weaponizing referrals to CFSA, which is our child protective here in the city, right? Like, how do you see that as part of the police-free schools? And we know there are many kids that are institutionalized out of state, psychiatrically, or in non-public schools in the region, and that's a less punitive situation, but they're still not in the city primarily educated. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, lots of thoughts. So I talk about police-free schools, and I even mentioned it earlier, like when we're talking about police-free schools, folks tend to zero in on the physical police officer as we know it. And while that is certainly a part of it, police-free schools is a long-term dream that we're looking at when we're talking about the entire policing infrastructure. Part of the demands around police-free schools are investments in things like violence interrupters, right? And things like paying community members to do safe passage. And the piece where I think it gets sticky is around investments in mental health clinicians and in mental health professionals. And so I'm like, how do I say this in a way that can be received? We know that when we're thinking about carceral systems, that in the way that the states have practiced providing social emotional support for folk, when those folk are Black folk, that even mental health clinicians, social workers, people that are intended or thought of to do good, often have this relationship with very punitive systems and practices. One of which for mental health clinicians that we're doing some work on, particularly DC Girls Coalition is leading, is the harm of the way that mandated reporting is occurring nationally, but here in DC as well. The practice of mandated reporting often leads to very carceral approaches and practices. It is rooted in patriarchy, where it is literally stripping the agency and autonomy from a young person, from an adult, from whoever, might be experiencing abuse, might be experiencing neglect, might need additional resources. The way that it's practiced in schools and what young people have often reported is they think that they're telling a trusted person of an experience that they had at home. And then the next thing they know, there's someone knocking on their door, asking questions, being invasive, criminalizing their caregivers, and re-traumatizing them, right? And that is because of mandated reporting. That is the way that is because of the process that not just mental health clinicians, but really everyone in the school environment is a mandated reporter. That is the way that the schools are requiring people to communicate to our child welfare system, and the way our child welfare system is then using these extremely punitive patriarchal approaches to support young people, to make sure that young people are safe by criminalizing their caregivers oftentimes. And so that's just one way that we see the child welfare system and the education system. All of these have like carceral implications and approaches, but that mandated reporting piece is a specific kind of item that folk have been trying to kind of pull back the layers on, to really think about how is this bias, how is this making over-reporting of neglect cases, mostly rooted in racism and anti-Blackness, under-reporting of abuse cases, particularly sexual abuse, mostly rooted in adultification and the thought that Black girls are fast and are asking for these things, right? And so we see that all. The only reason police have anything to do with this is because they're brought into the situation. But we see that in these traditional kind of care-based systems that we have, just perpetuating adultification, perpetuating racism, patriarchy, under the guise of safety, under the guise of protection.
Yeah, wow. I see you come on camera, Renee. I don't know if you want to say something, but I also want to just note, like, this is at a 10-minute mark, so I do want us to start to bring it to a close. But do you want to close us out with a thought?
No, I just want to let you know that I'm still here with y'all. That's all.
Well, thank you so much. And Sam, thank you for this. Like, there's so much, we know this overlap in the work that we're doing. I think it's a complete sentence where the youth and where the family comes out in public and organizes together, right? Whether it's on the youth side or the caregiver side, or that intersection between the two, where we do have young parents, and we want to make sure that we're also uplifting, because I feel that young parents are also an extreme target to this kind of more peaceful violence, so to speak, in a way. And thank you. And I think there's a lot of overlap with that other project you mentioned around looking at carcerality, and particularly with mandating reporting. I'm looking at Melody Webb with Mothers Outreach Network as a central supporter of that particular work. And hopefully you guys can team up and work together. Happy to, facilitate that connection. But thank you for your time, and thank you everyone that stayed on. I know some did not make the transition over to the other Zoom, and we'll get it better for the rest of our cycle. So we're 7 weeks with the DC Child Justice Coalitions. We are launching this political education boot camp. We spend an hour with a cohort of 10 together, cohort of 10 caregivers, self-advocates, and then we come on live to have a community conversation. We will be doing this for the duration in 7 weeks, and we look forward to next week, where we will be speaking specifically on the school-based behavioral health program. So thank you all so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to working together.